David Roches, who joins us now from Bethesda in Maryland. He is an associate professor at the National Defense University. Good to have you on the show. It's a powerful military alliance that was forged in the wake of World War II. It's been radically transformed in the post-Cold War and post-9/11 worlds. Do you feel that it's struggling to stay relevant?
Yeah, that's a good question. NATO was formed, actually in the Cold War, in the wake of the Russian nuclear explosions and the invasions of Poland and Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia. But pretty much since the end of the Cold War, people have said, well, is NATO relevant? Is NATO relevant? And the fact remains, the initial aims of NATO were to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. It's evolved over time, but I've heard this relevance thing in Bosnia when I was there. I've heard it about Kosovo, and I've heard it about Afghanistan. The bottom line is, whenever there's a major security threat, NATO becomes relevant. And it doesn't have to be at the top of the headlines every week. We've seen European efforts to try to bypass it, most notably the Bosnia fiasco up until the NATO intervention in 1995. That was done under UN and European leadership. When the going gets rough, people turn to NATO, and it will always be relevant because of that confidence.
David, so let me ask you, do you feel that China is perhaps the flavor of the month and is exactly the kind of threat that would give NATO the focus that some people say it needs?
Well, that's a good question. So the challenge with China is that their inroads into the European security realm are not overtly military. They tend to be economic. And the problem we have is that some of our European partners have decided that the European Union is the way to go. So they treat economic matters as being solely under the purview of the European Union, and then military matters as solely NATO. The problem is security encompasses both. So the big challenge will be to reconcile the European Union sphere with the NATO sphere. And quite frankly, there's an artificial separation right now, which works to the disadvantage of the European states units and works to the disadvantage of NATO.
Several internal conflicts, whether it's the one between Turkey and Greece, or perhaps even now officials coming out and say that Germany might be sanctioned because of the Nord Stream 2 gas line project. What do you think is perhaps some of the biggest dangers that the alliance faces internally?
Yeah, well, the first thing is there is a division among NATO members, what Donald Rumsfeld used to call old Europe and new Europe. And quite frankly, new Europe sees Russia as a predator. They see it as an active threat. Old Europe kind of thinks that that's something that should be consigned to history and is engaged in willful ignoring. There are Russian forces massing in Ukraine right now, but that wasn't on the front page of any of the major American newspapers or European newspapers, for that matter. The second problem is that increasingly there are people within NATO who also see the European Union as the driver that should supplant NATO. And unfortunately, the European Union has some members have always had that ambition, but they've never backed it up with military capacity. So at the end of the day, what you get are parallel headquarters controlling the same infantry battalion, the same, there's not new things. So that's the challenge for NATO.
All right. David Roches, I'm afraid we've got to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Sunday night. Thank you.
Thank you.